Good evening, fellow philosophers, and welcome back to another video. As you can see, the title of the video is going to be Evidence for Christ, Historical and Non-Biblical. Now, before we get into the slideshow, I just want to start with a quick little intro. Thank you guys for watching the video. I appreciate it. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share with a friend, all those good things. I'm aware that often when we do research into the Bible or research into the historicity of Christ, often atheists or agnostics or people who aren't Christians are skeptical when it comes to using the Gospels as historical evidence, even though they are historical documents and eyewitness testimony. So I decided it would be a good idea for those skeptical people to see the evidence for Christ that's historical and non-biblical. So an outsider's perspective on what was really going on during that time period and what was happening. So before we start, I wanted to do this quick little Bible verse. And if Christ be not risen, then is our preaching in vain, and your faith is also vain. 1 Corinthians 15:14. Now, practically what Paul is saying here is if the resurrection didn't happen, then Christianity is meaningless. So when you ask me, well, what's your evidence for the existence of God or or the truth of Christianity? And it lies in the resurrection of Jesus. Um, in my personal opinion, now this is I'm aware that this is just an opinion, although a lot of Christian apologists and atheist apologists will agree that it's not possible to prove or disprove the existence of God. So we're left with evidence, and I think the some of the best evidence we have is non-biblical evidence, surprisingly enough. So before we get into the non-biblical evidence, we need to understand, well, what is the Gospel's record of Christ? How does the Gospel record the life of Christ and what happened? So the Gospels were written around 40 to 100 A.D. There is some scholarly dispute about the date of some of the Gospels. We know that Mark is the earliest Gospel written, and John is the latest Gospel written. Some scholars put the Gospel of John later in the first century, to 100 A.D. And some scholars date Mark as early as 40 AD. Like I said, there's some dispute. Some scholars will probably argue Mark's closer to around 60 AD. For our sake, we're just going to write 40 to 100 AD is the span in which the Gospels were written. For case of you that don't know, AD is Anno Domini, which means it's Latin for the year of our Lord. So as far as we know, historically speaking, Jesus probably died either 30 or 33 AD, one of the each. We're going to go for 33 AD for the sake of our video. Like I said, there is scholarly dispute. I'm fine with either or. The 3-year difference doesn't really make that big of a difference to me, but getting into it, let's go with the first verse. When the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate the governor. Matthew 27, verses 1 through 2. And so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them, and delivered Jesus when he had scourged them to be crucified. Mark 15:15. After that he was seen of above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this present, but some are fallen asleep. After that he was seen of James, then of all the apostles, and last of all he was seen of me, that's Paul speaking, as one born out of due time. 1 Corinthians 6 through 8, King James. And they enter in and found the body of the Lord Jesus. Now, for the people who aren't familiar with the Gospels, I did want to do this brief overview because not everyone is familiar with what the Gospels tell about the story of Christ. And what we know about Christ is that he was a teacher who had disciples, and during his ministry, while he was teaching the Jewish people, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leaders and authorities, were not too happy with some of the claims and some of the teachings that Jesus was a part of. Because of this and a lot of the claims he made, they decided it would be best to give him over to the Roman authority at the time, Pontius Pilate, in order to be crucified. And you see at the bottom verse right there that after he was crucified, that they didn't find his body; his tomb was found empty. That's the Gospel's record. Now when the centurion and they that were with him watching Jesus saw the earthquake and those things that were done, they feared greatly, saying, Truly, this was the Son of God. Matthew 27:54. And the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was rent in the midst. Luke 23:45. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness all over the land unto the 9th hour. When the sixth hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the ninth hour. It's Mark and Matthew. So these verses are talking about after Jesus' crucifixion, his death by crucifixion, that there was a darkness over the whole land and that there were earthquakes. Now, with this being said, if there was a darkness over the land and these massive earthquakes, if this is an event that truthfully happened and is actual history, well, we would expect other people to write about it, right? I'll give you an example. In Islam, there's a claim that the Prophet Muhammad split the moon in two. Don't get me started, but that he split the moon in two, and that was one of his miracles. However, you'd think if someone split the moon in two that there would be writings about that. However, there are none besides what's in Islamic scriptures. But fortunately for Christianity, we actually have tons of evidence of people who elaborate on this darkness and these earthquakes that were happening after the crucifixion of Jesus. So now that we have the Gospel's record of what happened to Jesus, in brief, obviously, I don't want to go through the entire Gospel in this video. I'm assuming you have some background knowledge if you're watching this video. If not, I really encourage you to go read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, so you can get maybe some better understanding of what it is that we're going to be talking about in the video, because if you haven't read those texts, then some of this might be a tad bit confusing to you if you're not familiar with Christian theology. But with that being said, let's go to the next slide. Our first person of interest is Josephus. Josephus was a a Jewish historian who lived not too long after Jesus, and when he was under the Roman authority, the authorities gave him the permission to record Jewish history, and that's what Josephus does in his book, The Antiquities, which is written around 93 AD, we believe. And this is a quote from Josephus talking about Jesus. At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. And we get this from a 10th century Arabic manuscript that we found. We don't actually have the original copies of Josephus's work. That's pretty much the case with every ancient writing, just about. But we have manuscripts, and we do have later copies of what he wrote. And what's really interesting about this text is the fact that Josephus is recording history from an unbiased point of view. We understand that most Jewish people they weren't too fond of Jesus and his teachings because they considered it to be blasphemous, and I find it really interesting that Josephus, in his history, records, this history of Jesus. This is an outside source. This man's not a Christian, and he's recording that Jesus was indeed crucified by a man named Pontius Pilate, and that he had disciples, and that his disciples did. They claimed that he appeared to them after 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was risen from the dead. That's quite interesting. You would expect a Jewish historian to not want to elaborate on that idea, of course, because it would make their own ideology look flawed if this man who claimed to be their Messiah had rose from their dead and they played a hand in killing him and in his death. So that's our first non-biblical source of the historicity of Christ and his crucifixion. We can go on to Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman historian, I believe. I'm sorry, I forget some of these names. I just put these slides together not so long. Tacitus was a Roman historian, and Tacitus, in this first quote, he's talking about the Roman emperor at the time, Nero, and in this first quote, he's talking about the Great Fire of 65 A.D., I believe. And there's this rumor that Nero was, the culprit of the Great Fire, and Nero, being the Roman emperor, and not wanting to take the heat, so to say, for this tragedy, decides to blame it on people who are already hated in the Roman Empire, the Christians. So Tacitus writes, therefore, to stop the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished in the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, which is referring to Jesus Christ, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius. By sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. So, again, we have another non-Christian historian collaborating that Jesus was indeed crucified by a man named Pontius Pilate, and that he has followers who call themselves Christians or followers of Christ. So we already have two outside sources confirming that there's this man named Jesus who was crucified and he has some followers. I think we have strong enough evidence to believe that such is the case. Going on to the second quote, mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus, while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. The second quote elaborates on the idea that Christians were persecuted in early Rome. It was it wasn't it's not like today to where you can say, "Hey, I'm a Christian," just go on about your life. Like I mentioned in the last video, the disciples were martyred for their deaths, and not just the 12, but anyone else who claimed to be a Christian and a follower of Christ. It was looked down upon in that time. I mean, these people were savagely punished. We see right here, covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, nailed to crosses. Very similar to what we hear about the martyrdom of the apostles. So we know that this was going on in early Rome. Christians were having a really hard time. So this is Tacitus in 115 AD. Next, we have Thallus in 52 AD. Now, we don't actually have Thallus's original work. It's unfortunately been lost to history, but fortunately, we have it quoted by Julius Africanus later in life. That's how we know that the work exists. So Julius Africanus in this quote is quoting Thallus, and we believe that Thallus probably wrote this work around 52 AD. So it would have been about roughly 20 years after the death of Christ. Thallus states, on the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness Thallus in the 263rd book of his history calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. For the Hebrews celebrate the Passover on the 14th day according to the moon, and the passion of our Savior falls on the day before the Passover. But an eclipse of the sun takes place only when the moon comes under the sun, and it cannot happen at any other time but in the interval between the first day of the new moon and the last of the old, that is, at their junction. How then should an eclipse be supposed to happen when the moon is almost diametrically opposite the sun? And that's Julius Africanus quoting Thallus. Now, what Julius Africanus is doing here is he's kind of rebutting Thallus's idea. Thallus's idea was that that this darkness that came over the earth after Jesus' crucifixion was nothing more than a solar eclipse. However, when we look at the day when Jesus was crucified, and what Julius Africanus is mentioning here is the fact that it happened on a full moon, and we know that it's scientifically impossible for a solar eclipse to happen during a full moon. So the question then becomes, well, where does this darkness come from? How does the world just go dark out of nowhere? And obviously, Julius Africanus is attributing that to a supernatural cause that God calls the darkness. So, there's no other scientific explanation for why the land would have suddenly gone dark for no reason, and then the darkness just been lifted after 3 hours. There's no logical or scientific explanation for this. The solar eclipse doesn't work. So so what happens? So that's an interesting that's a really interesting idea that these these historians were already trying to find rebuttals in order to make the resurrection of Christ look like nothing more than something with a naturalistic explanation. But Julius Africanus is kind of making the claim, well, that doesn't make sense. You know, you're claiming it's a solar eclipse. You know, it's not scientific, nor is it logical. You know, the ancient world, they knew their astrology very well, very well. Astronomy, sorry. And then our next source, which is a few hundred years after, we have the Talmud, which was written around 400 to 500 AD. But one thing we know about the ancient Jewish people is that they transmitted their texts orally before they were written down. So we know that the Talmud could have possibly been transmitted much earlier orally before it was written down. But even so, we have some really interesting quotes in the Talmud. And for you who don't know, the Talmud is it's a Jewish scripture. Well, I guess I won't say scripture because they don't hold it to the same authority they would hold the Old Testament or the Bible, of course, the Hebrew Bible. However, it was written by it was written by Jewish rabbis at the time, and it's a commentary over the history of that time and the Bible. And in the Talmud, they write in Sanhedrin 43a 20, on Passover Eve, they hung the corpse of Jesus the Nazarene after they killed him by way of stoning, because he practiced sorcery, incited people to idol worship, and led the Jewish people astray. Now, obviously, this is more of a unfriendly writing about Jesus, which there are many. You know, the Jewish people, they view Jesus as a blasphemer, an idol worshiper, a sorcerer, a necromancer, someone who did dark magic. But what's really interesting about this is, why even give credit to Jesus at all? Why write about him at all? Why say he practiced sorcery? Um, you would think, if you didn't want people to buy into this idea of Christ being the Son of God, that they wouldn't even mention any of these things, that they would have just, you know, thrown them away. But the fact that they mentioned them and they had to attribute his miracles to sorcery gives us good evidence to believe that Jesus did perform miracles. Um, you know, you wouldn't expect your enemy to write something about you like that. You know. And then we have the next quote. Onkelos then went and raised Jesus the Nazarene from the grave through necromancy. What is the punishment of that man? A euphemism for Jesus himself in the next world. Jesus said to him, he is punished with boiling excrement. Now, what this quote here is saying is that this man, Onkelos, who was a necromancer, went and raised Jesus from the grave through necromancy. And it says that Jesus is being punished in hell in boiling excrement. Uh, which is quite interesting. And again, the same point. Why even say that he was raised from the dead? You know, why attribute it to necromancy? Why not just, if you want to write an unfriendly source, why not just say, well, he died, he never rose from the dead? Um, the reason is because there was a plenty of evidence to suggest that he did raise from the dead. There were eyewitnesses running around talking about, we saw this man risen from the dead. When you have, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of people by this time writing and talking about this man rising from the dead, the only thing you can really do at that point is try to attribute it to something else than what's not the actual cause. Then we have the next verse. Jesus went and stood up a brick and worshipped it as an idol. He caused the masses to sin. Jesus the Nazarene performed sorcery, and he incited the masses and subverted the masses and caused the Jewish people to sin. So again, we have them mentioning sorcery. Um, I think this is fairly good evidence to suggest that Jesus did indeed perform miracles. If we have other people calling him a sorcerer or a dark magician, it shows that he was doing something that they perceived as unnatural or supernatural at the time. Go to the next. The next we have is Phlegon. And we actually don't have Phlegon's original work either. We only have quotes from Phlegon in Origen's Contra Celsum, written about 140 A.D. And Origen was an author in this book. He's writing against Celsus, which we'll see later. Another historian. But When quoting Phlegon in his Contra Celsum, Origen writes, "And with regard to the eclipse in the time of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appears to have been crucified, and the great earthquakes which then took place." So again, we have another historian talking about earthquakes taking place and the darkness after Jesus' crucifixion. Now, Phlegon, in his 13th or 14th book, I think, of his Chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of the future events, but also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions. And this is something we see in the Gospels, especially, that Jesus was very well aware of future events and even his death and resurrection, that he was aware that this was going to happen. Now, obviously, I'm not using the Gospels as evidence within this specific video, but you can go read the Gospels yourself and see that the Bible makes many claims of the future and ends up being right. We'll go to the next quote. Phlegon records that in the time of Tiberius Caesar at full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from 6th hour to the 9th, which matches up with the Gospel's description of what happened, manifestly that one of which we speak, but what has an eclipse in common with an earthquake, the rending rocks, and the resurrection of the dead, and so great a perturbation throughout the universe, and calculation makes out that the period of 70 weeks, as noted in Daniel, is completed at this time. We get Julius Africanus writing. So what we're trying to figure out here is, or what Julius Africanus is trying to figure out here is, he's rebutting this idea that this darkness was just an eclipse, because he's asking, well, what does a solar eclipse have to do with the earthquakes? You know, what a coincidence is that, or the resurrection of the dead? Because we know that after the resurrection of Christ, that many people appeared seeing Old Testament prophets walking around in Judea, which is interesting. We'll go on to the next. In the 4th year, however, of Olympiad 202, an eclipse of the sun happened, greater and more excellent than any that had happened before it. At the 6th hour, day turned into dark night, so that the stars were seen in the sky. And an earthquake in Bithynia toppled many buildings of the city of Nicaea. Phlegon's 13th book, quoted in Jerome's translation of Eusebius. So we have different people quoting this historian Phlegon, who writes about what happens after the crucifixion of Christ. And again, we have another historical document talking about these earthquakes and this darkness. I think we're up to four different accounts of this event happening. Next, we have a Greek philosopher, Lucian of Samosata, who lived around 115 to 200 A.D. And he's actually kind of writing like an unfriendly document about Christians. He has more of a contrary view to the Christian ideology, but he gives us some good information in his writing here. The Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced this new cult, and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with a general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains their contempt for death and self-devotion. Their lawgiver, which is referring to Christ, taught they are all brothers from the moment they are converted, and deny the gods of Greece, and worship the crucified sage, and live after his laws. All this they take on faith. So, what do we get from this? Well, we know that again we understand that there's Christians around in this time, and that they're worshiping this man who taught them things that like they would be immortal and that they would never die. And what he's referring to there is the fact that we'll have everlasting life by putting our faith into Christ. And obviously, you know, him being a part of Greek ideology, you know, he finds this quite silly, and I kind of don't like the way he puts this. He says all this they take on faith, when it's not so much faith, but it's really eyewitness testimony and what they had saw. Next, we have Celsus from around 175 and 180 A.D. Celsus writes, O light and truth, he distinctly declares with his own voice, as ye yourselves have recorded, that there will come to you even others, employing miracles of a similar kind, who are wicked men and sorcerers and Satan, so that Jesus himself does not deny that these works at least are not all divine, but are the acts of wicked men, and being compelled by the force of truth, he at the same time not only laid open the doings of others, but convicted himself of the same acts. Is it not then a miserable inference to conclude from the same works that the one is God and the other sorcerers? Why ought the others, because of these acts, to be accounted wicked rather than this man, seeing they have him as their witness against himself? For he has himself acknowledged that these are not the works of a divine nature, but the inventions of certain deceivers and of thoroughly wicked men. Again, we have another person writing, calling Jesus a sorcerer and questioning these miracles that he'd done. We know that Jesus, he healed the sick, he healed the blind, he cured cripples, um, and the people at that time, especially the Jewish and religious authorities, they accused him of doing these things out of the name of Satan and having demons. Um, which is really interesting. I find that funny. You would think someone who's just doing things of those nature, like healing people, you wouldn't accuse them of being a wicked person. But that's what's happening with a lot of these people who are writing about Christ after his life, is we find out they're accusing him of being a sorcerer. If we have multiple people accusing Christ of being a sorcerer and doing miracles, it's probably reasonable to believe that he did indeed do things that were perceived as supernatural or or miraculous. So next we have Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger is, I believe, a Greek philosopher. It is my practice, my lord, to refer to you. Oh, no, 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 this isn't Greek. Sorry. This is Pliny the Younger is a Roman authority. Now, I remember where we're at now. He's a Roman authority, and in this letter, this is his 93rd letter, I believe, to who he's subject under. I forget the man's name, but he's writing and he's asking his own authority. He's asking him how to deal with these Christians that he's coming in contact with. And remember, Christians were persecuted in early Rome, and it was, like I said, it wasn't easy to be a Christian. There was torture involved, there was punishment involved, death. That's what he's kind of writing about in here. So, it is my practice, my Lord, to refer to you all matters concerning which I am in doubt. For who can better give guidance to my hesitation or inform my ignorance? I have never participated in trials of Christians. I therefore do not know what offenses it is the practice to punish or investigate, and to what extent, and I have been not a little hesitant as to whether there should be any distinction on account of age, or no difference between the very young and the more mature. Whether pardon is to be granted for repentance, or if a man has once been a Christian, it does him no good to have ceased to be one. Whether the name itself, even without offenses, or only the offenses associated with the name, are to be punished. So what he's asking him here is how do we deal with these Christians? What do we do with these people? Um, and again, this is more evidence to corroborate the fact that there were early Christians in Rome who were being persecuted and punished, and they were not willing to give up their belief. It wasn't just the apostles who were martyred for their beliefs, but it was normal, everyday people like me and you who were murdered and persecuted for their beliefs and what they had claimed to seen, some of them. And then later in this same letter, this is a different quote from the same letter. Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these two as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed, for I had no doubt whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness, and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. So we see here that he's talking about these people who are persisting in what he deems to be foolishness, because they won't worship the Roman or Greek gods. These Christians are staying true to their beliefs, and he's asking his authority, well, how do I deal with this? What do we do with these people, these Christians? It's like a sickness that's being spread. Um, it practically took over the Roman Empire, but that is the end of the presentation. I just wanted to show you guys some really quick Sorry. Yeah, I just want to show you guys some really quick historians who mentioned the life of Christ and the things that happened after his crucifixion and how these corroborate with what we see in the Gospels. We can go back to the first two slides really quick so you guys can read this while I'm talking. Um, the Gospels are written all all of these other writers, right? And all of these people are corroborating what the gospel says. And these are non-Christian sources. These are unfriendly sources and a few unbiased sources. We have Greek philosophers, Roman historians, Jewish historians writing about Christ and the things that happened and the things that he did. So it's like we're not just stuck to the Bible as the evidence for Christ. He was a real person who existed. His tomb was found empty, and his followers believed they had seen him risen from the dead. Those are historical facts that are not disputed by any major ancient historian. These aren't disputed at all. So, like I said in the last video, how do we best explain these facts? It's simple. Oh, Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead. Um, if you can give a better explanation, let me know. But I think that explains a lot of what happened after his crucifixion. There being this darkness over the earth and these earthquakes and these men saying, after they crucify him, like truly this man was the son of God. Even the people that killed him, they recognized that they recognized, see where we got Matthew 27:54 up top. They feared greatly, saying, truly this was the son of God. These people realized after what they had done that something was wrong. The earth isn't supposed to turn dark for 3 hours with a bunch of earthquakes. That's not natural, especially during a full moon. So I guess we'll wrap it up there. I want to say thank you guys for watching the video. If you stick all the way through to the end, I really appreciate it. Make sure you like, subscribe, and comment. And if you have any video requests or anything you want me to explore, man, let me know. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Y'all have a good one.